Imagine walking through the bustling streets of a city that makes modern Manhattan look like a sleepy village. Picture towering structures that dwarf today's skyscrapers, harbours filled with ships from every corner of the known world, and markets overflowing with treasures that would make Silicon Valley executives weep with envy. Now imagine this isn't some futuristic fantasy, but a reality that existed over 4,000 years ago, hidden in the mists of time and buried beneath centuries of forgotten history. What if I told you that while the rest of the world was still figuring out how to grow crops without killing them, one civilization had already mastered urban planning, international trade, and technologies that wouldn't be reinvented for millennia? What if the first true superpower on Earth wasn't Rome, wasn't Egypt, wasn't even Greece, but a civilization so advanced that when it mysteriously vanished, it took humanity nearly 3,000 years just to catch up to where they'd been? Welcome to the untold story of ancient India, where the impossible became routine and the unthinkable was just another Tuesday. I'm about to take you on a journey that will shatter everything you thought you knew about the dawn of human civilization. We're going to explore the mind-bending possibility that thousands of years before anyone had even dreamed of writing down history, India wasn't just a player on the world stage, it was the stage. But here's the thing that's going to blow your mind. This isn't some wild conspiracy theory or ancient astronaut nonsense. This is cold, hard, archaeological evidence that's been staring us in the face for over a century. Evidence so overwhelming that mainstream historians are finally starting to admit what should have been obvious all along. The story you're about to hear isn't just about ancient India. It's about rewriting the entire narrative of human achievement. Over the next hour, I'm going to present you with evidence so compelling, so meticulously researched, and so thoroughly documented that by the end of this video, you'll be questioning not just what you know about ancient India, but everything you've been taught about the origins of civilization itself. We're going to explore 7 game-changing discoveries that prove ancient India wasn't just ahead of its time. It was so far ahead that it's almost like they were playing a completely different game. First, we'll dive into the Indus Valley Civilization, a sprawling network of cities that would make modern urban planners weep with admiration. Then we'll uncover the mathematical and astronomical achievements that laid the foundation for every scientific advancement that followed. We'll examine trade networks that spanned continents, technologies that wouldn't be reinvented for thousands of years, and cultural innovations that shaped the very fabric of human society. But this isn't just about dusty artifacts and crumbling ruins. This is about understanding how a civilization that reached heights we're only now beginning to appreciate could simply vanish from the face of the earth, taking with it knowledge that humanity desperately needed and wouldn't recover for millennia. It's about recognizing that the story of human progress isn't the neat, linear narrative we've been taught, but a complex tapestry of rise and fall, achievement and loss, brilliance and tragedy. And here's what makes this even more incredible. Everything I'm about to show you comes from peer-reviewed archaeological research, published academic papers, and discoveries made by some of the most respected institutions in the world. This isn't fringe science or wishful thinking. This is the real deal, the kind of evidence that's so solid it's forcing textbooks to be rewritten and timelines to be completely reconsidered. Now I know what you're thinking. If this evidence is so compelling, why haven't you heard about it? Why isn't this common knowledge? Well, that's a story in itself, involving everything from colonial-era prejudices to the simple human tendency to stick with comfortable narratives, even when the evidence screams otherwise. The truth is, the story of ancient India as the world's first superpower challenges so many assumptions about human development that it's taken decades for the academic community to even begin accepting what the evidence has been telling us all along. But before we dive into the specifics, let me paint you a picture of just how radically different the world looked when India was at its peak. While most of humanity was still living in small agricultural settlements, Indian cities were home to hundreds of thousands of people. While other civilizations were just learning to work with bronze, Indian metallurgists were creating steel that wouldn't be matched in quality for another 1,000 years. While the rest of the world was navigating by the stars, Indian mathematicians had already calculated the Earth's circumference with stunning accuracy. This is the story of a civilization that achieved in centuries what it took the rest of humanity millennia to accomplish. It's the story of innovations so advanced that when European colonizers first encountered them, they couldn't believe they were looking at indigenous technology. It's the story of a superpower that rose so high and fell so completely that for centuries the world forgot it had ever existed. The evidence we're about to explore comes from archaeological sites scattered across the Indian subcontinent, from the massive urban centres of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro to the astronomical observatories of ancient kingdoms. It comes from mathematical texts that predate European achievements by centuries, from metallurgical artifacts that showcase technologies we've only recently rediscovered, and from trade goods found in archaeological sites from Mesopotamia to Southeast Asia, proving the incredible reach of ancient Indian commerce. But this isn't just about listing achievements. It's about understanding what it means for a civilization to be a true superpower. It's not enough to be militarily strong or economically prosperous. A real superpower shapes the world around it, influences other civilizations, and leaves a lasting impact that echoes through history long after its decline. And by every measure we use to define superpowers today, ancient India didn't just qualify, it set the standard. We'll explore how Indian innovations in mathematics became the foundation for scientific advancement across the ancient world. We'll see how Indian trade networks connected civilizations that might otherwise never have interacted, spreading not just goods, but ideas, technologies, and cultural practices across vast distances. We'll examine how Indian philosophical and spiritual concepts influenced thinking from Greece to China, shaping the development of human consciousness itself. And perhaps most importantly, we'll investigate the great mystery that haunts this entire story. How did a civilization this advanced, this influential, this thoroughly dominant, simply fade from prominence? What forces conspired to bring down a superpower that seemed unstoppable? And what lessons does their rise and fall hold for our modern world? The answers to these questions will take us on a journey through time and space, from the bustling harbours of ancient Indian ports to the royal courts where mathematical innovations were born, from the workshops where impossible metallurgical feats were accomplished, to the universities where knowledge was preserved and transmitted across generations. But I have to warn you, once you see the evidence I'm about to present, you can't unsee it. Once you understand the true scope of ancient Indian achievement, you'll never look at world history the same way again. You'll start noticing the Indian influences in civilizations you thought were completely independent. You'll recognize the echoes of Indian innovations in technologies you thought were modern inventions. You'll see the fingerprints of Indian thought in philosophical systems you believed originated elsewhere. This is more than just a history lesson. It's a fundamental reframing of human achievement, a recognition that the story of civilization is far more complex and interconnected than we've been led to believe. It's an acknowledgement that sometimes the most important stories are the ones that have been forgotten, buried not just by time but by the biases and assumptions of those who came after. So buckle up, because we're about to embark on an intellectual adventure that will challenge everything you think you know about the ancient world. We're going to explore a civilization so advanced that its achievements seem almost magical, so influential that its impact can still be felt today, and so mysterious that its ultimate fate remains one of history's greatest unsolved puzzles. The story of ancient India as the world's first superpower isn't just about one civilization's rise to greatness. It's about understanding that human potential has always been far greater than we imagined, that innovation and achievement aren't the exclusive domain of any one time period or geographic region, and that the past holds secrets that could revolutionize our understanding of what's possible. Are you ready to have your mind blown? Are you prepared to question everything you've been taught about the march of human civilization? Because once we start pulling at these threads, the entire tapestry of conventional history is going to unravel, revealing a picture so different from what you expect that you'll wonder how anyone ever believed the old story in the first place. Let's begin this journey into the forgotten superpower that changed the world, starting with the discovery that first cracked open this incredible story and forced archaeologists to completely reconsider everything they thought they knew about the ancient world. Picture this. It's 1856, and British engineers are laying railway tracks across the Punjab region of India. They need ballast for the tracks, and some bright spark decides that those ancient-looking bricks scattered around some nearby ruins would do the job perfectly. What they didn't realize is that they were literally grinding up one of the most important archaeological discoveries in human history to build a railroad. Those weren't just any old bricks. They were the remains of Harappa, one of the largest cities of what we now call the Indus Valley Civilization. And here's the kicker. While those British engineers were unknowingly destroying evidence of humanity's first great urban experiment, the rest of the archaeological world was still convinced that civilization began in Mesopotamia around 3005 BCE. Fast forward to 1922, when archaeologist John Marshall finally realized what they'd been sitting on all along. As his team carefully excavated what remained of Harappa, and later the spectacular site of Mohenjo-Daro, they uncovered something that shouldn't have existed, not according to everything they thought they knew about human development. What they found was a civilization that had solved problems the rest of the world wouldn't even recognize for thousands of years. We're talking about cities with populations exceeding 100,000 people, and this is at a time when most human settlements were lucky to hit a few hundred residents. These weren't ramshackle collections of mud huts either. These were planned cities with a level of sophistication that would make modern urban planners weep with envy. Let me paint you a picture of what walking through Harappa or Mohenjo-Daro would have been like around 2600 BCE. You'd step onto streets laid out in perfect grid patterns, so precise they looked like they were designed by someone with access to satellite imagery. The main boulevards were wide enough for two carts to pass comfortably. Wider, in fact, than many streets in medieval European cities built 3,000 years later. But here's where it gets really mind-bending. Every single house, and we're talking about thousands of houses across dozens of cities, had access to running water and sophisticated drainage systems. Not just the palaces or temples, but every house. Think about that for a moment. In ancient Rome, which we consider the pinnacle of classical civilization, only the wealthy elite had access to running water. In medieval London, people were still throwing their waste into the streets. But in the Indus Valley, over 4,000 years ago, even ordinary citizens enjoyed amenities that wouldn't become standard in European cities until the 19th century. The engineering behind this infrastructure is absolutely staggering. The Indus Valley engineers created a sewage system so advanced that when British colonial administrators first encountered it in the 1920s, they initially refused to believe it was ancient. The system included covered drains, manholes for maintenance access, and settling tanks that would separate solid waste from liquid waste. This is technology that Europe wouldn't develop until the Industrial Revolution. And we're just getting started. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro is a structure that defies everything we thought we knew about ancient construction techniques. This isn't just a big pool, it's a precisely engineered water management system built with materials and techniques that showcase a level of technological sophistication that seems almost impossible for its time period. The bath itself is lined with finely fitted bricks sealed with a natural tar called bitumen, the same material used in modern waterproofing. The engineering required to create a watertight structure of this size using only hand tools and human labor represents a level of technical knowledge that most civilizations wouldn't achieve for millennia. But here's what really sets the Indus Valley apart from every other ancient civilization we know about. The complete absence of monumental architecture designed to glorify rulers or gods. No massive pyramids, no towering ziggurats, no colossal statues of god-kings. Instead, all of their advanced engineering and architectural skills were focused on one thing: improving the quality of life for ordinary people. This tells us something profound about Indus Valley society. While other ancient civilizations were pouring their resources into monuments to dead pharaohs or temples to appease angry gods, the Indus Valley was building infrastructure. They were creating the world's first true urban civilization, one where technological advancement served human welfare rather than royal ego. The standardization across Indus Valley sites is another mind-blowing aspect that hints at a level of organization we associate with modern nation-states, not ancient city-states. Bricks found at sites hundreds of miles apart follow identical specifications. Weights and measures are standardized across the entire civilization. The urban planning principles are so consistent that you could drop someone into any Indus Valley city and they'd know exactly how to navigate it. This level of standardization across such a vast geographic area, we're talking about a territory larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, suggests a degree of administrative sophistication that challenges everything we thought we knew about ancient governmental systems. How do you maintain such precise standards across hundreds of settlements without modern communication technology? How do you ensure that a brick made in Harappa will fit perfectly into a structure built in Dolavira, 600 miles away? The answer points to something that shouldn't have existed in the ancient world: a highly organized, centralized administration with the ability to enforce standards across vast distances. This isn't just impressive for 2600 BCE, this would be impressive for any time period before the modern era. But perhaps the most shocking discovery about the Indus Valley Civilization is what we haven't found. Despite excavating dozens of sites and uncovering thousands of artifacts, archaeologists have found virtually no evidence of warfare, weapons, or military fortifications. No palaces, no royal tombs, no obvious signs of a ruling class living in luxury while others suffered in poverty. This absence of evidence for violence or extreme social stratification is so unusual that it's forced archaeologists to completely reconsider their assumptions about how ancient civilizations operated. Every other major ancient civilization we know about was built on military conquest and maintained through violence. But the Indus Valley seems to have created the world's first peaceful superpower, a civilization that achieved dominance through trade, technology, and urban planning rather than military might. The trade networks operated by the Indus Valley Civilization were absolutely massive in scope. Indus Valley artifacts have been found in archaeological sites from Afghanistan to the Arabian Peninsula, from Central Asia to South India. But this wasn't just random trade. This was systematic, organized commerce on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until the Roman Empire at its height. Indus Valley merchants weren't just trading locally produced goods. They were creating value-added products using raw materials imported from across the known world. They imported copper from Rajasthan, tin from Afghanistan, and lapis lazuli from as far away as Badakhshan. Then they combined these materials using advanced metallurgical techniques to create bronze tools and jewelry that were exported across their vast trade network. The level of quality control in Indus Valley manufacturing is extraordinary. Beads found at sites thousands of miles apart are so similar in size, shape, and drilling technique that they could have been made by the same craftsperson. This suggests not just advanced manufacturing techniques, but systematic training programs that ensured consistent quality across the entire civilization. And here's something that will absolutely blow your mind. The Indus Valley was creating precision-drilled carnelian beads using techniques that wouldn't be rediscovered until the 20th century. These beads have perfectly straight holes drilled through them, holes so precise and uniform that modern archaeologists initially thought they must have been made with diamond-tipped drill bits. The problem is, diamond-tipped drilling wasn't invented until the 1930s. Recent analysis has revealed that Indus Valley craftsmen developed their own technique for creating these precision holes using a combination of copper drills and abrasive powders. The level of skill required to create these beads is so high that modern craftsmen, using traditional techniques, struggle to replicate them. We're talking about manufacturing precision that rivals modern industrial processes, achieved over 4,000 years ago, using only hand tools. The implications of this technological sophistication extend far beyond bead making. If the Indus Valley could achieve this level of precision in small-scale manufacturing, what does that tell us about their capabilities in other areas? How advanced were their metallurgical techniques? What other technologies did they develop that we haven't yet discovered or understood? Recent archaeological discoveries are painting an even more incredible picture of Indus Valley technological advancement. At the site of Dolavira, archaeologists have uncovered what appears to be the world's first water conservation system, a complex network of dams, reservoirs, and channels that could capture and store monsoon rainwater for use during dry seasons. This isn't just impressive engineering, this is environmental science. The Dolavira system shows a sophisticated understanding of hydrology, climate patterns, and water management that enabled the Indus Valley to support large urban populations in what was already becoming an increasingly arid region. The genius of the system lies not just in its technical sophistication, but in its sustainability. Unlike many ancient irrigation systems that eventually led to soil salinization and agricultural collapse, the Indus Valley water management systems were designed to work with natural hydrological cycles rather than against them. This sustainable approach to resource management appears to have been a hallmark of Indus Valley Civilization. Their cities show evidence of sophisticated waste management, recycling systems, and resource conservation techniques that enabled them to support large populations without depleting their environment. But here's what makes all of this even more remarkable. The Indus Valley achieved all of this without a written language we can understand. Oh, they had writing. Thousands of inscribed artifacts prove that. But despite decades of effort by some of the world's best linguists and computer scientists, the Indus Valley script remains undeciphered. This creates one of the most frustrating paradoxes in archaeology. We can see the evidence of their incredible achievements. We can measure their technological sophistication. We can trace their trade networks across continents. But we can't read their own words about how they did it, why they did it, or what they thought about their accomplishments. Imagine if we could decode their script. Imagine the insights we might gain into their methods, their motivations, their worldview. The knowledge locked away in those undeciphered symbols might contain solutions to problems we're still grappling with today. Urban planning techniques that could revolutionize modern cities, environmental management strategies that could help us address climate change, social organization models that could reduce inequality and conflict. The Indus Valley script remains one of archaeology's greatest challenges, a puzzle that has resisted every attempt at solution. But even without being able to read their words, the material evidence of their achievements speaks volumes about a civilization that was operating on a completely different level from anything else in the ancient world. And this is just the beginning. The Indus Valley Civilization, extraordinary as it was, represents only the foundation of ancient India's claim to being the world's first superpower. As impressive as their urban planning and trade networks were, they pale in comparison to what came next. Because after the mysterious decline of the Indus Valley around 1900 BCE, ancient India didn't collapse into a dark age. Instead, it transformed into something even more remarkable, a civilization that would revolutionize human thought itself. The transformation that followed the decline of the Indus Valley wasn't gradual, it was explosive. Around 1500 BCE, just as the last Indus Valley cities were being abandoned, something extraordinary was happening in the northern regions of India. A new civilization was emerging, one that would take human intellectual achievement to heights that wouldn't be reached again for over 1,000 years. This is where the story gets really incredible, because what we're about to explore isn't just about technological advancement or urban planning. We're talking about a civilization that fundamentally rewrote the rules of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. They didn't just build better cities, they built better ways of thinking about reality itself. Let me start with something that will completely blow your mind. While European scholars were still centuries away from understanding that the Earth was round, ancient Indian mathematicians had not only calculated the planet's circumference, they'd done it with an accuracy that wouldn't be improved upon until the age of satellites. We're talking about measurements that were off by less than 1% from our modern calculations. But here's the kicker. They didn't just measure the Earth, they calculated the distances to the Moon and Sun with stunning precision. They mapped the movements of planets with an accuracy that European astronomers wouldn't achieve until the Renaissance. And they did all of this using mathematical techniques that were so advanced, so sophisticated, that when European colonizers first encountered them in the 18th century, they refused to believe they were looking at indigenous knowledge. The mathematician Aryabhata, working in the 5th century CE, calculated the length of a year as 365 days, 6 hours, 12 minutes, and 30 seconds. Our modern measurement is 365 days, 6 hours, 9 minutes, and 9.54 seconds. That's an error of less than 4 minutes out of an entire year. To put that in perspective, the European calendar system in use at the same time was off by 11 minutes per year, a discrepancy that would accumulate to months of error over centuries. But Aryabhata wasn't working in isolation. He was part of an intellectual tradition that stretched back over a millennium, building on mathematical foundations that were already ancient by his time. The Sulba Sutras, mathematical texts dating back to at least 800 BCE, contained geometric principles that wouldn't be formally proven in Europe until Pythagoras, and even then, Indian mathematicians had gone far beyond what Pythagoras ever achieved. Here's something that will make your head spin. Indian mathematicians were using the concept of zero as a number, not just as a placeholder, but as an actual mathematical entity, at least 500 years before it appeared anywhere else in the world. This might not sound revolutionary to you, because you've grown up in a world where zero exists. But try to imagine mathematics without zero. Try to do algebra without it. Try to develop calculus or advanced physics or computer science. It's impossible. The invention of zero wasn't just a mathematical breakthrough, it was a conceptual revolution that enabled every mathematical advancement that followed. And it happened in ancient India, centuries before the rest of the world even understood what they were missing. But zero was just the beginning. Indian mathematicians developed negative numbers, infinity as a mathematical concept, and the foundations of what we now call algebra. They created the decimal system that the entire world uses today. They developed trigonometric functions and calculated pi to more decimal places than anyone before them. The Bakshali manuscript, dating from the 3rd century CE, contains mathematical concepts that European scholars wouldn't develop until the Renaissance. We're talking about sophisticated algebraic equations, complex fraction calculations, and geometric theorems that demonstrate a level of mathematical sophistication that seems almost impossible for its time period. And this is where it gets really mind-bending. Indian mathematicians weren't just doing math for its own sake. They were applying these advanced mathematical concepts to solve real-world problems in astronomy, engineering, and commerce. They were using algebra to calculate compound interest. They were using geometry to design temple architecture. They were using trigonometry to predict eclipses. The astronomical observatories, built by ancient Indian kingdoms, weren't just impressive monuments. They were precision instruments designed to track celestial movements with incredible accuracy. The Jantar-Mantar observatories, some dating back over 1,000 years, could predict eclipses, track planetary movements, and calculate astronomical events with a precision that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the invention of the telescope. But here's what makes this even more extraordinary. These weren't just observatories for recording celestial events. They were part of a comprehensive system for understanding time itself. Ancient Indian astronomers developed calendars that were so accurate they're still in use today. They calculated the length of cosmic cycles that span millions of years. They understood concepts of deep time that European science wouldn't grapple with until the 19th century. The Surya Siddhanta, an astronomical text that may date back to the 4th century CE, contains calculations about the size of the universe, the speed of light, and the nature of time that seem almost prophetic in their accuracy. The text describes the universe as vast beyond imagination, composed of countless worlds and governed by mathematical laws that operate across cosmic scales. When European astronomers first encountered these texts in the 18th century, they were astounded. The mathematical sophistication was so far beyond what they expected from primitive civilizations that many refused to believe the texts were authentically ancient. But careful analysis has confirmed that these weren't later interpolations or European influences. These were genuinely ancient Indian achievements that had been preserved through centuries of oral and written tradition. The medical knowledge developed in ancient India is equally mind-blowing. The Charaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita, medical texts dating back over 2,000 years, describe surgical procedures, anatomical knowledge, and treatment protocols that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the modern era. Sushruta, often called the father of surgery, described over 300 surgical procedures and 120 surgical instruments. He performed cataract surgery, kidney stone removal, and plastic surgery procedures that European medicine wouldn't develop until the 18th century. The texts describe anesthesia techniques, sterilization procedures, and post-operative care protocols that demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of medical science. But this wasn't just about surgical technique. Ancient Indian physicians understood concepts of anatomy, physiology that were incredibly advanced for their time. They described the circulatory system, understood the role of the heart in pumping blood, and had detailed knowledge of the nervous system. They developed theories about disease transmission, immune system function, and the psychological aspects of healing that wouldn't be formally recognized in Western medicine until the 20th century. The pharmacological knowledge preserved in ancient Indian medical texts is absolutely staggering. These texts describe thousands of medicinal plants, their active compounds, proper dosages, and potential side effects. Modern pharmaceutical research has confirmed that many of these ancient remedies contain active compounds that are effective for exactly the conditions they were traditionally used to treat. What's even more impressive is the holistic approach to medicine that ancient Indian physicians developed. They understood that health wasn't just about treating symptoms, but about maintaining balance between physical, mental, and spiritual well-being. They developed comprehensive systems for preventive medicine, nutrition, exercise, and stress management that are remarkably similar to modern approaches to wellness and integrative medicine. The metallurgical achievements of ancient India are equally extraordinary. The iron pillar of Delhi, erected in the 4th century CE, is made from iron so pure and so skillfully forged that it hasn't rusted in over 1,600 years. Modern metallurgists have studied this pillar extensively, trying to understand how ancient Indian smiths achieved this level of corrosion resistance without modern technology. Recent analysis has revealed that the pillar contains trace amounts of phosphorus and other elements that create a protective coating on the surface. But the precision required to achieve this composition, using only traditional smelting techniques, represents a level of metallurgical knowledge that European smiths wouldn't develop until the Industrial Revolution. This wasn't an isolated achievement. Ancient Indian metallurgists were producing steel using techniques that created blades of legendary sharpness and durability. Damascus steel, prized throughout the ancient world for its superior quality, was actually made using Indian steel and Indian techniques. European attempts to reproduce these techniques failed repeatedly, and the secret of making true Damascus steel was lost until the 20th century. The scale of ancient Indian metallurgical operations was massive. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Indian ironworking sites were producing tons of steel annually, using furnaces that could achieve temperatures higher than most medieval European operations. This industrial-scale metallurgy supported not just local needs, but export markets that stretched across Asia and into Europe. But perhaps the most profound achievement of ancient Indian civilization was in the realm of ideas. The philosophical and spiritual concepts developed in ancient India didn't just influence local culture, they fundamentally reshaped human consciousness itself. The concept of meditation, now practiced by millions worldwide, was systematized and refined in ancient India into sophisticated techniques for mental training and self-awareness. The yoga traditions that emerged from ancient Indian philosophy weren't just physical exercises. They were comprehensive systems for understanding the relationship between mind, body, and consciousness. The philosophical schools that emerged in ancient India grappled with questions about the nature of reality, consciousness, and existence that European philosophy wouldn't seriously address until the Enlightenment. The concept of atomic theory was developed by Indian philosophers like Canada in the 6th century BCE, over 2,000 years before European scientists like Dalton formalized atomic theory in chemistry. Ancient Indian philosophers developed sophisticated theories about the nature of time, space, and causality that bear striking resemblances to concepts in modern physics. They understood that matter and energy were interchangeable, that time was relative rather than absolute, and that consciousness played a fundamental role in shaping reality. These weren't just abstract philosophical speculations. Ancient Indian thinkers developed practical techniques for exploring consciousness, systematic methods for investigating the nature of mind, and empirical approaches to understanding the relationship between subjective experience and objective reality. The influence of these ideas spread far beyond India's borders. Buddhist and Hindu concepts traveled along trade routes, influencing Greek philosophy, Islamic thought, and eventually European intellectual development. Many ideas that we consider fundamental to Western civilization actually have their roots in ancient Indian philosophical traditions. But here's what makes all of this even more remarkable. Ancient India managed to preserve and transmit this vast body of knowledge across centuries without losing its essential insights. While libraries burned and civilizations collapsed elsewhere, Indian traditions of oral transmission and systematic teaching ensured that mathematical formulas, astronomical calculations, medical procedures, and philosophical insights were passed down intact from generation to generation. The university system that emerged in ancient India was unlike anything that existed elsewhere in the ancient world. Institutions like Nalanda and Taxila weren't just centers of learning, they were international universities that attracted students from across Asia. These institutions had libraries containing hundreds of thousands of texts, laboratories for scientific research, and teaching methods that emphasized critical thinking and empirical investigation. The scale and sophistication of these educational institutions was extraordinary. Nalanda University, its peak, housed over 10,000 students and 2,000 teachers. It had multiple campuses, residential facilities, and specialized schools for different subjects. The admission process was so rigorous that only about 30% of applicants were accepted, standards that would be impressive for modern universities. These universities weren't just preserving ancient knowledge, they were actively advancing it. Students and teachers engaged in original research, developed new theories, and created innovations that pushed the boundaries of human understanding. The intellectual ferment at these institutions generated new insights in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and technology that influenced civilizations across the known world. The trade networks that supported this intellectual exchange were vast and sophisticated. Indian merchants weren't just trading goods, they were trading ideas. Mathematical concepts developed in Indian universities spread to the Islamic world and eventually to Europe. Astronomical observations made in Indian observatories influenced Chinese and Arabian astronomy. Medical techniques developed in Indian hospitals were adopted across Asia. This intellectual influence operated on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until the modern era. Ancient India wasn't just a regional power, it was a global center of learning whose influence shaped the development of human knowledge across continents. But here's where the story takes a mysterious turn. Despite all of these incredible achievements, despite creating what was arguably the most advanced civilization the world had ever seen, ancient India's golden age didn't last forever. By the medieval period, much of this knowledge had been lost, forgotten, or deliberately suppressed. The decline wasn't sudden, it was a gradual process that took place over several centuries. Political fragmentation weakened the centralized institutions that had supported learning and research. Foreign invasions disrupted trade networks and destroyed libraries. Social changes altered the systems that had preserved and transmitted knowledge. But the most devastating blow came from the colonial period, when European powers systematically dismantled Indian educational institutions, suppressed indigenous knowledge systems, and imposed their own limited understanding of science and mathematics. Centuries of accumulated wisdom were dismissed as primitive superstition, and the very people who had invented many of the mathematical and scientific concepts that Europeans were using were told that their ancestors had contributed nothing to human knowledge. This deliberate erasure of Indian achievements from the historical record was so thorough that it's only in recent decades that scholars have begun to recognize the true scope of ancient Indian accomplishments. Archaeological discoveries, careful analysis of ancient texts, and recognition of the Indian origins of many supposedly European innovations gradually revealed a picture of ancient Indian civilization that is far more impressive than anything that was taught in colonial-era schools. The implications of this rediscovery are staggering. If ancient India achieved this level of sophistication in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, what does that tell us about human potential? What other achievements might be hidden in the historical record, waiting to be rediscovered? How many other civilizations might have reached heights of achievement that we've simply forgotten or overlooked? The story of ancient India as the world's first superpower isn't just about one civilization's remarkable achievements. It's about recognizing that human capabilities have always been far greater than we imagined, that innovation and discovery aren't limited to any particular time period or cultural tradition, and that the past might hold keys to solving problems we're still grappling with today. As we continue to uncover the full scope of ancient Indian achievements, we're forced to confront uncomfortable questions about our assumptions regarding historical progress. The neat narrative of civilization advancing from primitive to sophisticated, from east to west, from ancient to modern, simply doesn't hold up when confronted with evidence of such extraordinary ancient achievements. The mathematical concepts, scientific methods, and technological innovations developed in ancient India weren't just remarkable for their time. Many of them were more advanced than anything Europe would achieve until the Renaissance or later. The social institutions, educational systems, and knowledge preservation methods were more sophisticated than most civilizations would develop until the modern era. This isn't about diminishing the achievements of other civilizations or engaging in cultural nationalism. It's about recognizing that human history is far more complex, far more interconnected, and far more remarkable than the simplified narratives we've been taught. The story of ancient India forces us to acknowledge that greatness can emerge from any corner of the world, at any time in history, and that the march of human progress has never been as straightforward as we like to believe. What makes this even more mind-bending is that we're not just talking about isolated achievements scattered across centuries. We're talking about a civilization that was operating at peak performance across multiple domains simultaneously. While ancient India was revolutionizing mathematics and astronomy, they were also transforming agriculture, revolutionizing trade, and creating social systems that wouldn't be matched elsewhere for over a millennium. The agricultural innovations alone would qualify ancient India as a superpower. They developed sophisticated irrigation systems that could support populations in the millions. They created crop rotation techniques that maintained soil fertility for centuries. They domesticated plants and animals that became staples of agriculture worldwide. But here's what's absolutely staggering. They did all of this while maintaining ecological balance in ways that modern agriculture is still struggling to achieve. The ancient Indian agricultural system wasn't just about maximizing yields, it was about creating sustainable abundance. They understood concepts of permaculture, companion planting, and integrated pest management that modern agricultural science has only recently rediscovered. Their farming methods actually improved soil quality over time, rather than depleting it, something that virtually no other ancient civilization managed to achieve. Recent archaeological surveys have revealed the true scale of ancient Indian agricultural infrastructure. We're talking about canal systems that stretch for hundreds of miles, reservoir networks that could store water for entire regions, and terracing projects that transformed mountainous terrain into productive farmland. The engineering required for these projects was so sophisticated that many of these ancient irrigation systems are still functional today, over 2,000 years after they were built. But here's where it gets really incredible. Ancient Indian farmers weren't just growing food for local consumption, they were producing agricultural surpluses on a scale that supported massive urban populations and extensive trade networks. Archaeological evidence suggests that some ancient Indian cities had populations exceeding 200,000 people, numbers that European cities wouldn't reach until the late medieval period. The ability to feed these massive urban populations required not just agricultural innovation, but sophisticated supply chain management. Ancient Indian merchants developed logistics systems that could move grain from rural areas to urban centers efficiently and reliably. They created storage facilities that could preserve food for months or even years. They established quality control systems that ensured consistent food safety across vast distribution networks. These weren't simple village markets we're talking about. These were complex commercial operations that would be impressive by modern standards. Ancient Indian traders were using standardized weights and measures, sophisticated accounting systems, and credit arrangements that enabled commerce on an international scale. They developed insurance systems to protect against trading risks, banking systems to facilitate long-distance transactions, and legal frameworks to resolve commercial disputes. The scale of ancient Indian commerce is almost impossible to comprehend. Indian merchants were operating trading posts from Southeast Asia to the Mediterranean. They were financing expeditions that crossed entire continents. They were creating commercial networks that connected civilizations that might otherwise never have interacted. But this wasn't just about moving goods from one place to another. Ancient Indian traders were creating value at every step of the process. They were importing raw materials, transforming them using advanced manufacturing techniques, and exporting finished products that commanded premium prices in markets thousands of miles away. The textile industry provides a perfect example of this value-added manufacturing. Ancient Indian craftsmen were producing cotton fabrics of such extraordinary quality that they became luxury items in Rome and China. The techniques they developed for spinning, weaving, and dyeing were so advanced that European textile manufacturers wouldn't match them until the Industrial Revolution. Roman writers described Indian cotton fabrics as woven wind, textiles so fine and light they seemed almost magical. Chinese sources speak of Indian silk that was superior to their own domestic production. Archaeological evidence shows that Indian textiles were being traded across the entire known world, from Britain to Indonesia. The dyeing techniques developed by ancient Indian textile workers were particularly remarkable. They created colors that were so vibrant and permanent that Roman historians wrote about Indian fabrics that retained their brilliant hues for decades. Modern chemical analysis has revealed that ancient Indian dyers were using complex mordanting processes and creating synthetic compounds that European chemists wouldn't discover until the 19th century. But textiles were just one example of ancient Indian manufacturing excellence. Indian metalworkers were producing steel that was sought after from Damascus to Toledo. Indian jewelers were creating pieces that adorned royalty from Persia to Rome. Indian shipbuilders were constructing vessels that could carry hundreds of tons of cargo across ocean distances. The shipbuilding technology developed in ancient India was particularly advanced. Archaeological evidence and historical descriptions suggest that Indian shipwrights were building vessels larger and more sophisticated than anything being produced elsewhere in the ancient world. These ships had multiple masts, sophisticated steering systems, and watertight compartments that could prevent sinking even if the hull was breached. Indian navigators developed techniques for oceanic navigation that enabled them to cross the Indian Ocean reliably and safely. They understood monsoon patterns, ocean currents, and celestial navigation methods that allowed them to reach destinations thousands of miles away with remarkable accuracy. European sailors wouldn't develop comparable navigation skills until the age of exploration. The ports that supported this maritime commerce were engineering marvels in their own right. Excavations at ancient Indian port cities have revealed sophisticated harbour facilities with deep-water docks, warehousing complexes, and administrative buildings that could handle massive volumes of international trade. These weren't simple fishing villages. These were major commercial centres that rivaled anything in the ancient Mediterranean. The economic sophistication required to manage this level of commercial activity is absolutely staggering. Ancient Indian merchants were using financial instruments that wouldn't appear in Europe until the Renaissance. They had developed systems for international banking, currency exchange, and commercial credit that enabled trade across vast distances and different monetary systems. Archaeological evidence shows that ancient Indian coins were being used as currency from Central Asia to Southeast Asia, clear evidence of India's role as a major economic power. But these weren't just simple metal tokens. Indian coins showed sophisticated metallurgical techniques, artistic design, and quality control that made them preferred currency for international trade. The administrative systems required to support this level of economic activity were incredibly advanced. Ancient Indian kingdoms developed bureaucracies that could manage complex tax systems, regulate commercial activities, and maintain law and order across vast territories. They created legal codes that governed everything from commercial contracts to property rights, providing the stable institutional framework that complex economies require. But here's what makes all of this even more remarkable. Ancient India was achieving this level of economic sophistication while maintaining social systems that were far more equitable than anything that existed elsewhere in the ancient world. While other ancient civilizations were built on slave labor and rigid social hierarchies, ancient Indian society developed systems that provided opportunities for social mobility and economic advancement across different social groups. The guild systems that organized ancient Indian commerce and manufacturing were remarkably sophisticated. These weren't just trade associations. They were complex institutions that provided training, quality control, financial services, and social support for their members. They developed apprenticeship programs that transmitted technical knowledge across generations, ensuring that manufacturing skills were preserved and improved over time. These guilds also served as important political and social institutions. They had their own laws, their own dispute resolution systems, and their own forms of democratic governance. In many ancient Indian cities, guild representatives played important roles in municipal government, ensuring that commercial interests were represented in political decision-making. The educational systems that supported this economic and technological sophistication were unlike anything that existed elsewhere in the ancient world. Ancient Indian universities weren't just training grounds for priests and philosophers. They were comprehensive institutions that taught practical skills alongside theoretical knowledge. Students at places like Taxila and Nalanda studied subjects that ranged from mathematics and astronomy to medicine and engineering. They learned metallurgy, agriculture, commerce, and manufacturing alongside philosophy and literature. This integration of practical and theoretical education created graduates who could apply advanced knowledge to solve real-world problems. The research conducted at these institutions was genuinely innovative. Ancient Indian scholars weren't just preserving and transmitting existing knowledge, they were actively advancing human understanding through systematic investigation and experimentation. They developed empirical methods for testing theories, created instruments for making precise measurements, and established systems for peer review and quality control that ensured the reliability of their discoveries. The international character of these institutions is particularly remarkable. Students came from across Asia to study at Indian universities, creating an intellectual environment that fostered cross-cultural exchange and collaborative research. Chinese, Central Asian, and Southeast Asian scholars brought their own knowledge traditions, which combined with Indian insights to create new syntheses and innovations. This international exchange wasn't limited to formal educational institutions. Ancient Indian courts attracted scholars, artists, and craftsmen from across the known world. These cosmopolitan environments became centers of innovation, where different cultural traditions could interact and influence each other. The artistic and architectural achievements that emerged from this cultural synthesis were extraordinary. Ancient Indian architects developed building techniques that enabled them to construct temples and palaces of incredible complexity and beauty. They mastered the use of stone, creating structures that have survived for over 1,000 years, despite earthquakes, floods, and military attacks. The mathematical precision required for some of these architectural projects is mind-boggling. Ancient Indian architects were calculating structural loads, designing earthquake-resistant foundations, and creating ventilation systems that maintained comfortable interior climates without mechanical assistance. They understood principles of engineering that European architects wouldn't master until the Renaissance. But, perhaps most importantly, they were doing all of this while creating buildings that were not just functional, but profoundly beautiful. Ancient Indian architects developed aesthetic principles that influenced artistic traditions across Asia. Their innovations in sculpture, painting, and decorative arts created visual languages that are still influential today. The cultural influence of ancient India extended far beyond art and architecture. Indian philosophical and spiritual concepts spread across the ancient world, influencing religious and intellectual traditions from Greece to China. The concept of ahimsa, non-violence, became a fundamental principle in multiple religious traditions. The practice of meditation spread to virtually every culture that had contact with India. These weren't just abstract philosophical ideas, they had practical applications that influenced how societies organized themselves. Ancient Indian concepts of governance, law, and social organization were adopted and adapted by kingdoms across Asia. The idea that rulers had moral obligations to their subjects, that laws should be based on ethical principles rather than arbitrary power, and that society should provide opportunities for all citizens to develop their potential. These concepts originated in ancient India and gradually spread across the civilized world. The medical and scientific knowledge developed in ancient India had similarly far-reaching influence. Indian medical techniques were adopted by physicians from Persia to China. Indian mathematical concepts became the foundation for scientific advancement across multiple civilizations. Indian astronomical observations were used by scholars from Baghdad to Beijing. But here's what makes this influence even more remarkable. It wasn't imposed through military conquest or political domination. Ancient India spread its influence through the peaceful means of trade, education, and cultural exchange. Indian merchants, scholars, and teachers carried their knowledge to distant lands, not as conquerors, but as partners in collaborative ventures. This peaceful projection of soft power is what truly qualifies ancient India as the world's first superpower. Military might can create empires, but lasting influence requires something more: the ability to shape how other civilizations think, organize themselves, and understand their place in the world. Ancient India achieved this level of influence through the sheer attractiveness of its ideas and innovations. The evidence for this influence is overwhelming. Archaeological sites across Asia contain artifacts that show clear Indian influence. Ancient texts from multiple civilizations reference Indian knowledge and methods. Linguistic analysis reveals that key technical and philosophical terms in languages from Persian to Chinese have Indian origins. But perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from the fact that many of these influences are still visible today. Mathematical concepts developed in ancient India are still taught in schools worldwide. Medical techniques pioneered by ancient Indian physicians are still used in modern practice. philosophical insights developed by ancient Indian thinkers continue to influence contemporary thought. This enduring influence raises profound questions about how we understand historical causation and cultural development. If ancient Indian innovations were so influential, so foundational to later human achievement, why has this influence been so systematically overlooked in conventional historical narratives? The answer to this question reveals some uncomfortable truths about how historical knowledge is constructed and transmitted. The colonial period didn't just involve political and economic domination, it involved a systematic effort to rewrite history in ways that justified European supremacy and minimized non-European achievements. This historical revisionism was so thorough that it convinced even educated Indians that their ancestors had contributed little to human civilization. The very people whose mathematical innovations made European scientific advancement possible were taught that mathematics was a European invention. The descendants of the physicians who had developed surgical techniques that European medicine was just beginning to adopt were told that their medical traditions were primitive superstition. The psychological impact of this historical erasure was devastating. It created a sense of cultural inferiority that persisted long after political independence was achieved. It convinced entire populations that innovation and achievement were the exclusive domain of Western civilization, making it difficult for them to recognize and build upon their own cultural strengths. But the archaeological and textual evidence that has emerged over the past century has made this revisionist history increasingly difficult to maintain. The sheer weight of evidence for ancient Indian achievement has forced even skeptical scholars to acknowledge that conventional historical narratives need to be fundamentally reconsidered. The implications of this recognition extend far beyond academic history. If ancient India could achieve this level of technological, economic, and cultural sophistication, what does that tell us about human potential more generally? What other civilizations might have reached similar heights without leaving clear traces in the historical record? How many other innovations and insights might be waiting to be rediscovered in neglected historical sources? These questions become even more urgent when we consider the challenges facing our modern world. Climate change, resource depletion, social inequality, and technological disruption are problems that require innovative solutions. The fact that ancient civilizations faced and solved similar challenges suggests that the past might hold valuable insights for addressing contemporary problems. The sustainable agricultural techniques developed by ancient Indian farmers could inform modern efforts to create food security while protecting environmental resources. The social institutions that enabled ancient Indian society to maintain stability while promoting innovation could provide models for contemporary governance. The educational methods that produce such remarkable intellectual achievements could inspire reforms in modern educational systems. But accessing these insights requires more than just archaeological excavation and textual analysis. It requires a fundamental shift in how we think about the relationship between past and present. This is also of different cultural traditions and between human potential and historical circumstance. The story of ancient India as the world's first superpower challenges us to recognize that greatness can emerge from any corner of the world at any time in history. It reminds us that human achievement is not the exclusive property of any particular civilization or time period. Most importantly, it suggests that the future might be far more remarkable than we dare to imagine, if we can learn to build upon the full heritage of human achievement rather than just the fragments that have survived in our limited historical narratives. The evidence I'm about to present will fundamentally change how you think about ancient warfare and military technology. Because while most of the ancient world was still fighting with bronze weapons and basic siege tactics, ancient India had developed military innovations that were so advanced they seem almost science-fictional. Let's start with something that will absolutely blow your mind. The ancient Indian text known as the Arthashastra, written by the political strategist Chanakya around 300 BCE, doesn't just describe military tactics. It outlines strategies for psychological warfare, intelligence gathering, and what we would now call special operations that wouldn't be formally developed in European military doctrine until the 20th century. But here's where it gets really incredible. This wasn't just theoretical military science. Archaeological evidence shows that ancient Indian kingdoms were implementing these strategies on a massive scale. We're talking about intelligence networks that spanned continents, psychological operations that could destabilize enemy kingdoms without a single battle, and military technologies that gave Indian armies decisive advantages over any opponent they faced. The metallurgical advances we discussed earlier weren't just about making better tools, they revolutionized warfare itself. Ancient Indian weapons makers were producing steel that was so superior to anything else available that Indian weapons became legendary across the ancient world. Arab chroniclers wrote about Indian swords that could cut through European armor like it was cloth. Chinese military manuals specifically recommended acquiring Indian weapons whenever possible. But this wasn't just about individual weapon quality. Ancient Indian armies were equipped with standardized weapons and armor on a scale that other civilizations wouldn't achieve until the medieval period. They had developed mass production techniques that could outfit entire armies with identical high-quality equipment. The logistical sophistication required to achieve this level of standardization across armies numbering in the tens of thousands is absolutely staggering. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed the true scope of ancient Indian military engineering. Excavations at ancient battlefield sites have uncovered evidence of siege weapons that used principles of physics and engineering that European military engineers wouldn't understand for another 1,000 years. We're talking about catapults that could accurately hit targets at distances that shouldn't have been possible with ancient technology, and defensive systems that could withstand siege warfare for months or even years. The Mauryan Empire, which reached its peak under Emperor Ashoka in the 3rd century BCE, maintained a standing army that was larger than anything Europe would see until the Napoleonic era. But here's what makes this even more remarkable. This wasn't just a massive collection of soldiers. This was a professionally organized military machine with sophisticated command structures, standardized training programs, and logistic systems that could support military operations across an empire that stretched from Afghanistan to southern India. The military manuals that have survived from this period describe training regimens that were incredibly advanced for their time. Ancient Indian military academies weren't just teaching soldiers how to fight, they were training officers in strategy, logistics, engineering, and what we would now call combined arms tactics. These institutions produced military leaders who could coordinate infantry, cavalry, and elephant units in complex battlefield maneuvers that required a level of tactical sophistication that European armies wouldn't develop until the Renaissance. But perhaps the most mind-blowing aspect of ancient Indian military technology was their understanding of chemistry and what we might call early chemical warfare. Ancient texts describe weapons that used incendiary compounds, smokescreens, and even primitive forms of biological warfare that demonstrate a knowledge of chemistry that was centuries ahead of its time. The Greek historian Megasthenes, who visited the Mauryan court in the 4th century BCE, wrote detailed accounts of Indian military technology that his contemporaries found almost impossible to believe. He described weapons that could launch projectiles with incredible accuracy, defensive systems that seemed impregnable, and military tactics that were unlike anything he had encountered in his extensive travels across the known world. What makes these accounts particularly credible is that they're supported by archaeological evidence and corroborated by sources from multiple cultures. Chinese military texts from the same period describe Indian weapons and tactics with similar amazement. Persian chronicles speak of Indian military innovations that were adopted by armies across Central Asia. But here's what's truly extraordinary about ancient Indian military power. It wasn't just used for conquest and domination. The concept of dharmic warfare, fighting according to ethical principles, was a uniquely Indian contribution to military thought that influenced military traditions across Asia. The Mahabharata, one of the world's great epic poems, isn't just a story about a war. It's a sophisticated treatise on military ethics that grapples with questions about the moral use of power that military theorists are still debating today. The concept that military force should be used only when necessary, that civilians should be protected even during warfare, and that victory achieved through unethical means is ultimately hollow. These ideas originated in ancient Indian military philosophy and gradually spread to other civilizations. Emperor Ashoka's transformation from a conquering emperor to a ruler dedicated to nonviolence represents one of the most remarkable examples of enlightened leadership in human history. After witnessing the devastation caused by his conquest of Kalinga, Ashoka developed a philosophy of governance that emphasized moral authority rather than military might. His edicts, carved in stone across his empire, articulated principles of ethical leadership that wouldn't be formally recognized in international law until the modern era. But this wasn't just abstract philosophy. Ashoka implemented practical policies that demonstrated how military power could be subordinated to moral principles without compromising security or stability. His empire maintained peace and prosperity for decades without relying on military oppression or constant warfare. The influence of these Indian military innovations extended far beyond the subcontinent. The concept of professional military education spread to China, where it influenced the development of military academies. The metallurgical techniques for producing superior weapons were adopted by Arab and Persian armies. The strategic principles outlined in texts like the Arthashastra influenced military thinking from Central Asia to Southeast Asia. But perhaps most importantly, the Indian model of combining military effectiveness with ethical constraints provided a template for civilized warfare that influenced the development of international law and military ethics. The idea that there are moral limits to what can be done even in warfare, that military power should serve ethical purposes rather than mere domination, these concepts have their roots in ancient Indian military philosophy. The naval technologies developed by ancient Indian kingdoms were equally impressive. Archaeological evidence and historical accounts describe Indian ships that were larger and more sophisticated than anything being built elsewhere in the ancient world. These vessels weren't just cargo ships, they were floating fortresses capable of projecting Indian power across the Indian Ocean. The Chola dynasty, which reached its peak around 1000 CE, maintained a navy that could conduct military operations from the Maldives to Indonesia. Their naval expeditions weren't just raids or trading missions, they were sophisticated military campaigns that required the coordination of hundreds of ships and thousands of personnel across ocean distances. The shipbuilding techniques that made these naval operations possible were remarkably advanced. Indian shipwrights developed construction methods that created vessels capable of carrying heavy weapons while remaining seaworthy in ocean conditions. They understood principles of naval architecture that European shipbuilders wouldn't master until the age of exploration. The navigational techniques used by these naval forces were equally sophisticated. Indian navigators could cross the Indian Ocean with remarkable accuracy, using knowledge of monsoon patterns, ocean currents, and celestial navigation that enabled them to reach specific destinations thousands of miles away. This navigational expertise was so advanced that Arab and European sailors would later rely on Indian pilots for their own ocean voyages. But what makes these naval achievements even more remarkable is that they were integrated into comprehensive strategic visions that encompassed land and sea operations. Ancient Indian military planners understood that controlling trade routes and coastal regions required naval power, but they also recognized that naval operations had to be coordinated with land-based political and economic policies. The result was a form of maritime strategy that wouldn't be seen again until the European colonial period. Indian kingdoms could project power across ocean distances, influence the policies of distant rulers, and control trade networks that spanned the entire Indian Ocean. This was naval power used not just for military conquest, but for creating spheres of influence that advanced Indian economic and political interests. The intelligence networks that supported these military operations were incredibly sophisticated. Ancient Indian kingdoms developed systems for gathering information about distant threats, monitoring the activities of potential enemies, and coordinating responses across vast territories. These weren't casual arrangements, they were professional intelligence services with trained operatives, secure communication methods, and analytical capabilities that could process complex information and provide actionable intelligence to decision-makers. The Arthashastra describes intelligence techniques that are remarkably similar to modern espionage methods. It outlines procedures for recruiting agents, maintaining cover identities, gathering information without detection, and analyzing intelligence to identify threats and opportunities. The level of sophistication described in these texts suggests that ancient Indian kingdoms had developed intelligence capabilities that other civilizations wouldn't achieve until much later. Archaeological evidence supports these textual accounts. Excavations at ancient Indian sites have uncovered communication systems, secure storage facilities, and other infrastructure that would have supported sophisticated intelligence operations. The scale and complexity of these systems suggest that intelligence gathering was considered a crucial component of statecraft, not just an occasional necessity. The diplomatic strategies employed by ancient Indian kingdoms were equally advanced. Indian rulers understood that military power was most effective when combined with sophisticated diplomacy that could achieve strategic objectives without resorting to warfare. They developed negotiation techniques, alliance systems, and treaty arrangements that enabled them to manage complex relationships with multiple neighbors simultaneously. The concept of mandala, the circle of states, was a uniquely Indian contribution to diplomatic theory that recognized the complex interdependencies between neighboring kingdoms. This wasn't just abstract political science. It was a practical framework for managing international relations that enabled Indian rulers to maintain stability and advance their interests through skillful diplomacy rather than constant warfare. These diplomatic innovations were particularly important because ancient India was surrounded by multiple competing powers. Chinese dynasties to the north, Central Asian nomadic confederations to the northwest, and Southeast Asian kingdoms to the south, all represented potential threats that required careful management. The ability to maintain peaceful relations with some neighbors while deterring aggression from others required diplomatic skills of the highest order. The economic strategies that supported these military and diplomatic achievements were equally sophisticated. Ancient Indian kingdoms understood that long-term military effectiveness required strong economic foundations. They developed taxation systems that could support large armies without crushing economic productivity, trade policies that generated wealth while maintaining security, and resource management strategies that ensured sustainable military capabilities. The integration of economic, military, and diplomatic strategies created what we might call comprehensive national power, the ability to achieve strategic objectives through the coordinated use of all available resources. This holistic approach to statecraft was remarkably advanced for its time and provided Indian kingdoms with significant advantages over rivals who relied primarily on military force. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of ancient Indian strategic thinking was its long-term perspective. Indian rulers weren't just focused on immediate military victories or short-term economic gains. They were building institutional capabilities that could maintain Indian power and influence across generations. The educational institutions that trained military officers, diplomats, and administrators were designed to preserve and transmit strategic knowledge across time. The legal systems that govern military service, diplomatic relations, and economic activities were created to provide stability and predictability that would support long-term planning. The cultural traditions that celebrated strategic thinking and ethical leadership were cultivated to ensure that future generations would maintain the values and capabilities that made Indian power possible. This long-term perspective enabled ancient Indian civilizations to maintain their influence for centuries, even when faced with significant challenges. The ability to adapt to changing circumstances while preserving core capabilities allowed Indian kingdoms to survive and thrive through periods of political instability, economic disruption, and military pressure that destroyed other civilizations. The technological innovations that supported these strategic capabilities continued to evolve throughout the ancient period. Indian engineers developed new weapon systems, improved fortification designs, and created communication technologies that enhanced military effectiveness. Indian scientists made discoveries in metallurgy, chemistry, and physics that had direct military applications. Indian mathematicians developed calculation methods that improved logistics, navigation, and strategic planning. But this technological innovation wasn't pursued in isolation from ethical considerations. Ancient Indian strategic thinkers understood that technological superiority without moral legitimacy was ultimately self-defeating. They developed frameworks for ensuring that military innovations served ethical purposes and that technological advantages were used responsibly. This integration of technological capability with ethical constraint created a model of strategic thinking that was uniquely Indian. The idea that power should be exercised according to moral principles, that technological innovation should serve human welfare, and that military force should be subordinated to ethical purposes These concepts emerged from ancient Indian strategic culture and influenced military thinking across Asia. The legacy of these strategic innovations extends far beyond their historical period. The principles of ethical warfare developed in ancient India influenced the development of international humanitarian law. The diplomatic techniques pioneered by Indian kingdoms provided models for peaceful conflict resolution that are still relevant today. The strategic frameworks that integrated military, economic, and diplomatic capabilities offered approaches to statecraft that modern nations continue to study and adapt. But perhaps most importantly, the ancient Indian example demonstrates that military power and ethical leadership are not incompatible. The idea that a civilization can be both strategically effective and morally admirable, that military strength can serve peaceful purposes, and that true security comes from justice rather than mere force. These insights from ancient Indian strategic culture offer valuable lessons for our contemporary world. The evidence for ancient Indian strategic sophistication is overwhelming and undeniable. From the archaeological remains of advanced weapons and fortifications to the textual accounts of sophisticated military doctrine, from the diplomatic achievements that maintained peace across vast regions to the technological innovations that revolutionized warfare itself, every aspect of the evidence points to the same conclusion. Ancient India wasn't just militarily powerful, it was strategically sophisticated in ways that other ancient civilizations never achieved. The integration of military capability with diplomatic skill, technological innovation with ethical constraint, and immediate tactical effectiveness with long-term strategic vision created a model of comprehensive national power that was centuries ahead of its time. This strategic sophistication was one of the key factors that enabled ancient India to achieve and maintain superpower status for such an extended period. It wasn't just economic prosperity or cultural influence that made India dominant, it was the ability to project power effectively while maintaining legitimacy, to achieve strategic objectives while preserving moral authority, and to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining core capabilities. Understanding this strategic dimension of ancient Indian achievement helps explain how a civilization could maintain its influence across such vast territories and time periods. It also provides insights into why Indian strategic culture continued to influence other civilizations long after India's political decline, and why many of the strategic principles developed in ancient India remain relevant to contemporary international relations. But this strategic sophistication also raises profound questions about what happened to these capabilities and why they weren't sufficient to prevent eventual decline. The answers to these questions will take us deeper into the mystery of how the world's first superpower ultimately lost its dominant position, setting the stage for the rise of other powers and the reshaping of the global order. The question of what caused the decline of ancient India's superpower status is one of the most complex and fascinating puzzles in world history. Because here's the thing that will absolutely blow your mind. This wasn't a civilization that collapsed due to internal weakness or technological stagnation. This was a superpower at the absolute height of its capabilities that somehow lost its dominant position despite maintaining most of the advantages that had made it great in the first place. To understand what happened, we need to examine a series of interconnected factors that gradually eroded India's position over several centuries. But here's what makes this story so compelling. Each of these factors, taken individually, should have been manageable for a civilization with India's resources and capabilities. It was only their combination, occurring simultaneously across multiple domains, that created a perfect storm of decline. Let's start with something that might surprise you. Climate change. Not the modern kind we're dealing with today, but a dramatic shift in weather patterns that began around 1200 CE and fundamentally altered the environmental conditions that had supported Indian civilization for millennia. This wasn't just a minor fluctuation in rainfall or temperature, this was a comprehensive transformation of the monsoon systems that had made Indian agriculture so productive. The medieval warm period, which had benefited Europe and enabled the Viking expansion, had the opposite effect on the Indian subcontinent. Rising temperatures disrupted the delicate balance of atmospheric conditions that drove the monsoon rains. Archaeological evidence shows that many regions of India experienced severe droughts during this period, while others faced unprecedented flooding as weather patterns became increasingly unpredictable. But here's what makes this environmental challenge so significant. Indian civilization had always been built around the assumption of predictable monsoons. The agricultural systems, the urban planning, the trade networks, even the religious calendar, everything was designed to work with consistent seasonal patterns that had remained stable for thousands of years. When these patterns began to shift, the effects cascaded through every aspect of Indian society. Agricultural yields became unreliable, forcing governments to divert resources from other priorities to manage food security. Urban populations had to be relocated as some cities became unsustainable, while others faced overcrowding from climate refugees. Trade routes that had functioned for centuries became unreliable as rivers changed course and harbors silted up. The genius of ancient Indian civilization had always been its ability to work with natural systems rather than against them. But when those natural systems began changing rapidly, that very adaptability became a weakness. Civilizations that were less dependent on environmental consistency proved more resilient to climatic disruption. But climate change alone wouldn't have been enough to bring down a superpower with India's capabilities. What made the environmental challenges so devastating was their interaction with political developments that were simultaneously fragmenting Indian unity and reducing the civilization's ability to respond effectively to external threats. The Gupta Empire, which had represented the last great unified Indian state, had begun fragmenting by the 6th century CE. What replaced it wasn't chaos, but something almost worse from a strategic perspective, a complex patchwork of competing kingdoms that were individually powerful but collectively unable to coordinate responses to civilization-level challenges. This political fragmentation had devastating consequences for India's ability to maintain its technological and economic advantages. The research institutions that had driven Indian innovation depended on patronage from wealthy rulers who could fund long-term projects. When political authority became divided among dozens of competing courts, the resources available for scientific research and technological development were dramatically reduced. Even more damaging was the loss of standardization that had been one of ancient India's greatest strengths. When the Mauryan and Gupta empires maintained unified control, they could enforce consistent weights, measures, currency, and quality standards across vast territories. This standardization had been crucial for maintaining the trade networks and manufacturing systems that generated India's economic dominance. As political authority fragmented, each kingdom began developing its own standards and regulations. What had once been a unified economic system became a collection of separate markets with different rules, different currencies, and different quality expectations. The transaction costs of doing business across these political boundaries made Indian merchants less competitive in international markets, where they now faced rivals who could operate within unified political systems. But the political fragmentation had an even more insidious effect. It created opportunities for external powers to exploit Indian divisions. The classic strategy of divide and conquer became devastatingly effective against a civilization that had always derived much of its strength from unity and coordination. The Islamic invasions that began in the 8th century CE were successful not because Islamic military technology was superior to Indian capabilities, but because Islamic commanders were brilliant at exploiting the political divisions within India. Rather than facing a unified Indian response, Islamic armies could ally with some Indian kingdoms against others, using Indian resources and knowledge to defeat Indian resistance. This pattern repeated itself over and over again. Mahmud of Ghazni's raids in the 11th century was successful because he could find Indian allies who provided intelligence, logistics, and even military support for his campaigns. The Delhi Sultanate was established not through overwhelming force, but through skillful manipulation of Indian political divisions. But here's what makes this political fragmentation even more tragic. It wasn't the result of inherent Indian weaknesses or cultural deficiencies. The political systems that had unified ancient India were sophisticated and effective. The fragmentation occurred because successful political institutions require continuous adaptation to changing circumstances, and the environmental and economic pressures of the medieval period made traditional forms of political organization increasingly difficult to maintain. The administrative systems that had worked brilliantly when India was the dominant economic power in a stable international environment became burdensome when India faced increased competition and environmental uncertainty. The costs of maintaining unified political control across such vast territories became prohibitive when economic surpluses were reduced by climate disruption and trade competition. And this brings us to one of the most important factors in India's decline: the rise of alternative trade routes that bypassed Indian merchants and reduced India's centrality to international commerce. For thousands of years, India's geographic position had made it the natural hub for trade between East and West. If you wanted to move goods from China to Europe or from Southeast Asia to the Middle East, the most efficient routes went through Indian ports and employed Indian merchants. But by the medieval period, alternative routes were becoming increasingly viable. The Islamic expansion had created unified political control across much of Central Asia and the Middle East, enabling overland trade routes that could bypass Indian territory entirely. At the same time, improvements in navigation and shipbuilding technology made it possible for merchants to sail directly between distant ports without stopping at Indian intermediary markets. The economic consequences of this shift were enormous. Indian merchants who had once controlled the most profitable segments of international trade found themselves competing with rivals who had lower overhead costs and more direct access to markets. The manufacturing industries that had depended on imported raw materials and exported finished products faced increased competition from producers who were closer to either suppliers or consumers. But the most devastating impact was on the knowledge networks that had been one of ancient India's greatest assets. When Indian merchants controlled international trade routes, they also controlled the flow of information between different civilizations. Indian universities and research institutions had access to the latest developments in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and technology from across the known world. As India's centrality to international trade declined, so did its access to global knowledge networks. Indian scholars found themselves increasingly isolated from developments elsewhere, while scholars in other regions gained direct access to information that had previously been mediated through Indian institutions. This isolation had cascading effects on Indian technological development. The innovations that had kept Indian manufacturing competitive depended on continuous research and development supported by knowledge exchange with other civilizations. As that exchange became more limited, Indian technological progress began to slow relative to developments elsewhere. The irony is absolutely devastating. The very success of Indian civilization in spreading knowledge and technology around the world ultimately created competitors who could challenge Indian dominance. The mathematical techniques developed in Indian universities were being used by Islamic scholars to improve navigation and engineering. The metallurgical knowledge that had made Indian weapons legendary was being applied by craftsmen in Damascus and Toledo to create products that competed with Indian exports. But perhaps the most significant factor in India's decline was something that seems almost contradictory. The very philosophical and cultural achievements that had made Indian civilization so influential also made it vulnerable to exploitation by less scrupulous competitors. The concept of ahimsa, non-violence, that had become central to Indian culture created ethical constraints on Indian political and military behavior that weren't shared by their rivals. While Islamic invaders were willing to use any means necessary to achieve their objectives, Indian rulers often limited their responses based on moral principles that put them at a strategic disadvantage. The emphasis on knowledge sharing and open intellectual exchange that had made Indian universities so successful also made Indian technological innovations available to competitors who weren't necessarily interested in reciprocating. While Indian scholars continued to publish their discoveries and welcome international students, their rivals were increasingly focused on protecting their own technological advantages. The religious tolerance that had enabled Indian civilization to absorb and integrate diverse cultural influences also made it difficult to develop the kind of unified resistance that would have been necessary to repel determined external threats. While Islamic states could mobilize their populations around shared religious identity, Indian kingdoms struggled to overcome regional and sectarian divisions. These cultural factors didn't make Indian civilization weak. They had been sources of strength for centuries. But they did make India vulnerable to exploitation by civilizations that were willing to abandon ethical constraints in pursuit of strategic advantage. The same openness and tolerance that had enabled India to become a superpower also made it easier for rivals to infiltrate, subvert, and ultimately dominate Indian institutions. The technological stagnation that resulted from these combined pressures was particularly devastating because it occurred at a time when other civilizations were experiencing rapid innovation. While Indian development was slowing, Islamic scientists were making breakthrough discoveries in mathematics and astronomy. Chinese engineers were developing new manufacturing techniques and navigation technologies. European merchants were creating new financial instruments and commercial practices. The gap between Indian capabilities and global best practices, which had favored India for millennia, began to reverse. By the time European colonial powers arrived in India, they found a civilization that was still sophisticated and wealthy, but no longer possessed the technological advantages that had made ancient India dominant. But here's what makes this technological decline so tragic. It wasn't the result of any inherent limitations in Indian intellectual capabilities. The same mathematical and scientific traditions that had produced extraordinary innovations in ancient times were still active in medieval India. Indian scholars were still making important discoveries and developing new technologies. The problem was that these innovations were no longer being supported by the institutional infrastructure that had made ancient Indian research so effective. The unified funding, the international collaboration, the systematic knowledge sharing, the long-term institutional continuity, all of these factors that had enabled ancient India to achieve technological supremacy were being eroded by political fragmentation and economic competition. Individual Indian scientists and inventors continued to produce remarkable work, but their achievements were no longer being systematically collected, preserved, and built upon in ways that could maintain India's technological leadership. The knowledge networks that had once made Indian universities the centers of global learning were breaking down, leaving even brilliant individual discoveries isolated and unable to influence broader technological development. The military consequences of this technological stagnation were particularly severe. While Indian metallurgy was still producing high-quality weapons, Islamic and European armourers were developing new alloys and manufacturing techniques that provided superior performance. While Indian military engineers were still capable of impressive defensive works, their rivals were developing new siege technologies and artillery systems that could overcome traditional Indian fortifications. The naval technologies that had enabled ancient Indian kingdoms to project power across the Indian Ocean were becoming obsolete as European shipbuilders developed vessels that were larger, faster, and more heavily armed. The navigational knowledge that had made Indian pilots indispensable for ocean voyages was being superseded by new instruments and techniques that reduced dependence on local expertise. But perhaps the most devastating military consequence was the loss of strategic unity that had enabled ancient Indian kingdoms to coordinate their defences against external threats. When political authority was unified, Indian military planners could develop comprehensive strategies that utilized the subcontinent's full defensive potential. When authority was fragmented, each kingdom had to rely on its own limited resources and couldn't count on support from neighbors who might be pursuing their own conflicting interests. The economic consequences of these military weaknesses created a vicious cycle that accelerated India's decline. As external threats increased, Indian kingdoms had to devote increasing resources to military expenditures that didn't contribute to economic productivity. The resources that had once funded research, education, and infrastructure development were being diverted to immediate security needs. At the same time, the constant threat of military conflict made long-term economic planning increasingly difficult. Merchants couldn't invest in trade routes that might be disrupted by warfare. Manufacturers couldn't develop new production facilities that might be destroyed by raids. Agricultural improvements couldn't be implemented in regions that faced periodic invasion. The psychological impact of this transition from dominance to vulnerability was perhaps even more damaging than the immediate material consequences. For thousands of years, Indian civilization had been characterized by confidence, innovation, and ambition. Indian scholars, merchants, and rulers had approached challenges with the assumption that Indian capabilities were sufficient to overcome any obstacles. As India's relative position declined, this confidence began to erode. Instead of pushing the boundaries of what was possible, Indian institutions became increasingly focused on preserving what they already had. Instead of seeking new opportunities for expansion and innovation, Indian leaders became preoccupied with defending against external threats and internal divisions. This psychological shift had profound consequences for Indian cultural and intellectual development. The openness to new ideas that had made Indian civilization so dynamic began to give way to conservatism and defensiveness. The international perspective that had kept Indian institutions connected to global knowledge networks was replaced by increasing focus on local concerns and immediate threats. The educational institutions that had once attracted students from across the known world began to lose their international character as political instability made travel more dangerous and economic pressures reduced funding for foreign students. The research programs that had once pushed the boundaries of human knowledge became increasingly focused on practical applications for immediate problems. But here's what makes this decline so historically significant. It wasn't just the end of one civilization's dominance. It was the loss of institutional capabilities and knowledge systems that had taken millennia to develop and that wouldn't be fully replaced for centuries. When the Roman Empire collapsed, much of its knowledge was preserved in the Eastern Empire and eventually recovered during the Renaissance. When Chinese dynasties fell, succeeding dynasties typically maintained continuity with previous cultural and technological achievements. But the decline of Indian superpower status involved the loss of unique institutional capabilities that were never fully reconstituted. The university systems that had made Indian institutions the centers of global learning were never rebuilt on the same scale. The trade networks that had connected Indian merchants to markets across the known world were never fully restored under Indian control. The technological innovation systems that had kept India at the forefront of human knowledge were never revived with their original effectiveness. This loss had consequences that extended far beyond India itself. The decline of Indian institutional capabilities removed one of the most important centers of knowledge production and dissemination from the global intellectual network. Discoveries that might have been made in Indian universities were never realized. Innovations that might have emerged from Indian research institutions were never developed. Solutions to problems that might have been found through Indian approaches to science and technology were never discovered. The world became intellectually poorer as a result of India's decline, not just because Indian knowledge was lost, but because the unique approaches and perspectives that Indian institutions had brought to global knowledge networks were no longer available to inspire and guide research elsewhere. Understanding this decline also helps explain some of the persistent patterns in subsequent world history. The technological and institutional advantages that enabled European colonial expansion weren't just the result of European innovation. They were partly the consequence of European acquisition and adaptation of knowledge systems that had originally been developed in India and other ancient civilizations. The mathematical techniques that enabled European navigation, the metallurgical knowledge that made European weapons effective, the commercial practices that supported European trade networks, many of these had roots in Indian innovations that had been transmitted to Europe through Islamic intermediaries during the medieval period. But the most important lesson from India's decline may be about the fragility of civilizational achievement itself. The institutional capabilities that enable a civilization to maintain technological leadership, economic dominance, and cultural influence are not permanent acquisitions that can be taken for granted. They require continuous investment, adaptation, and renewal to remain effective in changing circumstances. The factors that caused India's decline, environmental pressures, political fragmentation, technological competition, cultural vulnerabilities, are not unique to any particular time period or civilization. They represent recurring challenges that every dominant power must address if it wants to maintain its position over time. Modern superpowers face similar challenges today. Climate change is creating environmental pressures that could destabilize existing economic and political systems. Political polarization is creating fragmentation that could reduce the ability to respond effectively to collective challenges. Technological competition is intensifying as multiple centers of innovation compete for dominance. Cultural and ethical constraints continue to create vulnerabilities that less scrupulous competitors can exploit. The story of ancient India's rise and fall isn't just about understanding the past, it's about recognizing patterns that continue to shape the present and future. The same factors that enabled India to become the world's first superpower are still relevant for understanding how civilizations achieve and maintain dominance. The same factors that caused India's decline are still threatening contemporary powers. But perhaps most importantly, the story of ancient India demonstrates that decline is not inevitable. The factors that caused India's fall were not inherent weaknesses in Indian civilization, but responses to specific historical circumstances that could potentially have been managed differently, with different choices and different priorities. This suggests that contemporary civilizations facing similar challenges might be able to avoid similar declines if they can learn from India's experience and develop more effective strategies for managing the complex interactions between environmental, political, technological, and cultural factors that determine civilizational success or failure. The evidence for what caused ancient India's decline is complex and multifaceted, but it points to clear lessons about the requirements for maintaining superpower status over extended periods. It's not enough to achieve dominance. Sustaining it requires continuous adaptation, strategic unity, technological innovation, and the ability to manage both internal cohesion and external competition simultaneously. Understanding these requirements and recognizing how they interact with each other may be crucial for any civilization that hopes to achieve lasting influence and avoid the fate that befell the world's first superpower. The story of ancient India's decline isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a warning and a guide for anyone who wants to understand how great civilizations rise, fall, and potentially rise again. The lessons from ancient India's rise and fall aren't just academic curiosities gathering dust in university libraries. They're urgent warnings for our modern world, because if you look closely at the patterns that brought down the world's first superpower, you'll see those exact same forces at work today. Think about it. Climate change disrupting established systems? Check. Political fragmentation undermining collective action? Absolutely. Technological competition from rising powers? Without question. The erosion of institutional knowledge and expertise? Happening right before our eyes. But here's what gives me hope, and what should give you hope too. Unlike those ancient civilizations, we have something they never had. We have their story. We have the ability to learn from their mistakes and recognize the warning signs before it's too late. The archaeological evidence, the mathematical texts, the astronomical calculations, the metallurgical innovations, all of this proves beyond any doubt that human potential has always been far greater than we imagined. The capabilities that we think make our modern world special, they're not new. They're rediscoveries of knowledge that was achieved thousands of years ago by people who had access to far fewer resources than we do today. This isn't just about giving credit where credit is due, though that's certainly important. This is about understanding that if ancient India could achieve such extraordinary heights with Bronze Age technology, imagine what we could accomplish if we fully embraced the lessons they left behind. The sustainable agricultural techniques that supported millions of people without depleting the environment, the educational systems that produced breakthrough discoveries across multiple fields simultaneously, the trade networks that connected distant civilizations peacefully and profitably, the philosophical frameworks that balanced individual achievement with collective welfare. These weren't primitive experiments that we've outgrown. These were sophisticated solutions to problems we're still struggling with today, and the evidence suggests that in many cases the ancient solutions were actually more elegant and effective than our modern approaches. But perhaps the most important lesson from ancient India's story is this. Greatness isn't about where you come from or what resources you start with. It's about how you think, how you organize yourselves, and whether you're willing to pursue knowledge and innovation with the kind of systematic dedication that produces lasting achievements. Ancient India became a superpower not because they had some natural advantage, but because they created institutions and cultural practices that maximized human potential. They built systems that could preserve and transmit knowledge across generations. They developed approaches to problem solving that integrated multiple perspectives and disciplines. They created networks that could coordinate complex activities across vast distances. Most importantly, they maintained these capabilities for centuries, proving that sustainable excellence isn't just possible. It's achievable if you understand the principles involved and commit to implementing them consistently. The story of ancient India forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about our modern assumptions. We like to think that progress is automatic, that each generation will naturally be more advanced than the one before. But the evidence shows that knowledge can be lost, capabilities can decline, and civilizations can fall from heights it takes millennia to climb again. This isn't inevitable, but it's not automatic either. Maintaining civilizational achievement requires conscious effort, systematic investment, and the wisdom to learn from both successes and failures. It requires recognizing that the institutions and practices that enable greatness must be continuously renewed and adapted to changing circumstances. The rediscovery of ancient India's achievements isn't just academic exercise. It's a call to action. If we can understand how they achieved such remarkable success, we can apply those same principles to address the challenges facing our world today. If we can learn from their mistakes, we can avoid the pitfalls that brought down even the most advanced ancient civilizations. The evidence is all there, waiting for us to study it, understand it, and build upon it. The mathematical innovations that could revolutionize our approach to science and technology, the organizational principles that could help us coordinate global responses to shared challenges, the philosophical insights that could guide us toward more sustainable and equitable ways of living. But accessing this knowledge requires more than just reading about it. It requires the same kind of systematic dedication to learning and innovation that made ancient India great in the first place. It requires institutions that can preserve and transmit knowledge across generations. It requires networks that can coordinate complex activities across vast distances. It requires the wisdom to balance individual achievement with collective welfare. Most importantly, it requires the humility to recognize that we don't have all the answers, and that sometimes the solutions we need have already been discovered by people who lived thousands of years ago. The story of ancient India teaches us that human potential is limitless, but only if we're willing to learn from the full heritage of human achievement, rather than just the fragments that have survived in our limited historical narratives. The choice is ours. We can continue to ignore the lessons of the past and repeat the same mistakes that have brought down every great civilization in history, or we can embrace the full scope of human knowledge and capability, building upon the achievements of our ancestors to create something even greater. The evidence for ancient India's status as the world's first superpower is overwhelming and undeniable. But more than that, it's inspiring. It proves that extraordinary achievement is possible, that sustainable excellence can be maintained, and that the future could be far more remarkable than we dare to imagine. The question isn't whether we have the potential to achieve greatness. Ancient India proved that human potential is virtually unlimited. The question is whether we have the wisdom to learn from their example and the dedication to build upon their legacy. That's the real gift that ancient India has left us. Not just the knowledge of what they achieved, but the proof that such achievements are possible and the guidance for how we might achieve even more. The story of the world's first superpower isn't just about the past. It's about the future we could create if we're brave enough to reach for it.